All right, so we're going to continue the second half of this lecture on the rise of fascism, Nazism, and militarism. If you look at this graph here, and by the way, I want to remind you, please, in your notes, take down questions that you have for when I return. This graph is really telling on that link between the economy and the rise of these dictatorships. If you look at this unemployment, this is estimated German unemployment from 1900 to 1940. And I want to draw your attention to the rise in the 20s, all the way up to around 15%. There we're seeing hyperinflation in the economy, but then it starts dipping back down. But right around 1929, when the global economic crisis hits, you see a huge spike all the way up to around 1931, 1932, 33, where we're hanging around 30% unemployment. That's about 1 out of every 3 people is unemployed. And then you see it drastically collapse. That drastic collapse you're seeing there in unemployment, that is when the Nazis take power and then Hitler refuses to pay reparations. He then, after refusing to pay reparations, he then begins to build up the military, with the Treaty of Versailles forbade. It strictly limited the military. And that created jobs, and he started building highways and other things and putting people to work. And really what he's doing was, the government was debt spending, but was able to do that because it no longer had to send so much money elsewhere and put people back to work. And so the question is, why would people be willing to go along with this dictatorship, give up their democracy, and go along with, quite frankly, what seems to be a very strange ideology in Nazism, and the scary one at that is because they have people put back to work. There's food back on the table, so to speak, and you can see that in that graph. And it's going to have horrible consequences for the people of Germany and the people of the rest of Europe. One of those people had horrible consequences for is obviously Jews of Europe, which the Nazis had identified as foreigners. The discrimination began against German Jews first. German Jews at the time saw themselves as German, just like anyone else, but Hitler and the Nazis had identified them as the other, as people that didn't belong in their society. And actually, they went as far as identifying them and blaming them partly for the Treaty of Versailles and Germany's loss in World War I, which they came up with this fantastical descriptions of a communist and Jewish plot to weaken Germany and get them out of the war. Hitler described it as being stabbed in the back. It was complete nonsense, but it was able to strike a chord with some anti-Semitism that had been present in Germany for a very long time. People already scared of economic consequences, people looking for a scapegoat. The discrimination against Jews starts very slowly. What you see in this picture is what's known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. It's kind of viewed by historians as the beginning of the Holocaust. This night, stores were smashed, some synagogues were burned, some people were beat up, a few people were killed. But it seemed to be a declaration of war, so to speak, on the Jewish population of Germany and what would eventually become the Jewish population of Europe as a whole. The Nuremberg laws were the first enacted laws under the Nazi government to officially discriminate Jews. The Nuremberg laws took away citizenship for all Jews and did not allow them to practice the professions anymore. And so we're going to go back and we'll look at that discrimination a little more closely as we look at the Holocaust as the war goes on. But I want you to keep in mind that the Holocaust is something that moves along slowly. The death camps and the images that we get of the Holocaust, as we've learned in school, that comes later on. So this is kind of a slow process that begins at discrimination and, of course, culminates in genocide. But if we look at Japan, Japan's a little bit different. They do react to economic crisis that hits their countries. But what we've seen in Japan, going back to the Meiji Restoration, when Japan began industrializing, they really, it's effective to look at Japan in several ways. One, there is certain cultural features of the Japanese, some aspects of the Bushido Code, the old samurai culture, militaristic ideas that kind of carried over through Meiji Restoration. But a big part is they really do start acting like Westerners. Once they begin industrializing and consuming natural resources at a very large rate, just like their European counterparts, they wanted to establish colonies and an empire. And they began to do so rather quickly. In 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was essentially their expansion into Korea and coming into conflict with the Russians. And so what we see with them is there is a desire to create an empire. And we see the rise of, in Japan, It is, again, ultra-nationalistic, and like the Nazis, it's racially based. The Japanese began to view themselves as superior, and the rightful leaders of Asia and the Pacific. Um, but the key to understanding Japanese militarism is that really in World War II, it's the Japanese military that's in power. Here's the emperor at the time, Emperor Hirohito. And what we see is the rise in the 20s and 30s and then in the 40s that Hirohito really, much like the Tokugawa shogunate, is not exercising full control. We see the real control of government decisions falling into the hands of military leaders, generals that are making these claims. And they tend to think militaristically and how to expand Japanese borders. And Japan is a resource-poor country, especially if it's going to be industrialized. So in order to be the power that it wanted to be, it had to expand. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which many historians say this is really the beginning of World War II. This may be the mark of World War II beginning, because if World War II exists in two spheres, a European and Pacific theater, Europe doesn't begin until 1939 with the invasion of Poland, but fighting had been going on already for 8+ years in Asia with Japanese expansion. So perhaps it's a little European-centric to look at World War I starting in 1939, when in reality much of it starting in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Much like with Hitler refusing to pay reparations or building up his military, we're going to see the League of Nations do nothing. And so it's going to be a common theme in the march up to war, is the League of Nations seems to be weak and unwilling to enforce peace. 4 years later, Japan declared war on China and engaged into warfare against China and captured much of the country. And again, the League of Nations did nothing. And in World War II, much of the dying occurs in the Soviet Union and in China. So much of the fighting and the dying occurs in those places, not necessarily in France, although there's certainly a lot of fighting that goes on in Western Europe. The war is very intense. And with this ultra-nationalistic, racial-based militarism in the Japanese government, we see atrocities, much like what we'll see in Europe as the Nazis expand. This is Nanjing or Nanking. It's referred to as the rape of Nanking, in which civilians were just murdered and massacred by Japanese troops going in and terrorizing China. So China certainly feels the blow and is going to resist the Japanese throughout the war. So much of the fighting and dying in Asia occurs between the Japanese and the Chinese. But again, this open violation of peace and invasion of a country, the League of Nations does absolutely nothing. There was this idea in people's heads that the best thing they could do is to completely avoid another war, avoid another World War I, never engage in World War again, to preserve peace at all cost. And that comes out in this philosophy known as appeasement. And appeasement means you find ways to appease the aggressor to prevent war. And having saw what we've seen happen on the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme and other areas, I think we can understand that a little bit, that mentality. But the unfortunate thing is it only helped lead to another war. Mussolini breaks peace before war begins in World War I in his invasion of Abyssinia, what we know today as Ethiopia. He invaded Ethiopia, an area that they've been trying to take as a colony for a very long time. Ethiopians had one airplane in their entire air force, had very little weapons, and weren't able to mount much of a resistance against them. The emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, as you can see here in this picture, goes to the League of Nations and pleads with them. He said, look, you guys were designed to preserve the peace. We've been invaded by an aggressor for no other reason than expansionistic desires. You should do something about it. And in reality, the League of Nations, for the most part, does nothing. And Italy gets away with what it's doing. Along with appeasement, we see Hitler in several different cases in which the League of Nations could have stood up to Hitler and didn't. Early on, refusing to pay reparations. Then the increase of the size of his military. Then in the late 30s, his occupation of the Rhineland, which was along the Rhine River, which is a border between Germany and France, which was supposed to be demilitarized. Hitler just marched his troops in there and occupied it. And the League of Nations says, well, maybe, it used to be their territory. We should just let them have it, and it's not worth fighting another war over. Then in 1936, Italy and Germany and Japan formed the Axis alliance. So we're seeing an alliance system grow up again. League of Nations does nothing about that. In 1937, Germany annexed Austria, which was called the Anschluss. Austria was explicitly mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles, and it was forbidden for Germany to unite with Austria. Yet it happened in 1937. The League of Nations essentially said it wasn't worth war. The Austrians are Germans. Who are we to tell the German people, German culture, German-speaking people, that they can't be all united, and it's not worth engaging in another war where millions of people could die. So all this happens is only encouraging Hitler to be more expansionistic, which even since Mein Kampf, he said that he would be an expansionistic power. This comes to a head when Hitler decides to move on Czechoslovakia. The area you see here in yellow is known as Sudetenland. It was an area taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. It was given to Czechoslovakia as kind of a buffer zone. It is populated mostly by German-speaking peoples, and Hitler said they should be part of Germany, that he's seeking to reunite Germany, and he was going to move onto the Sudetenland. And Czechoslovakia freaked out and went to the League and went to the Allies, and so a meeting was held. So we're starting to see a little bit of standing up to the Allies. This became known as the Munich Conference, September 29, 1938. It was the Allies led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. And Chamberlain was seeking peace at essentially all costs. And he met with Hitler, and Hitler said, look, I'm just trying to unite the Germans back together. I'm just trying to right the wrongs of the Treaty of Versailles. And after I get to Sudetenland, I promise I don't want any more territory. Germany is satisfied. We're all happy and great and everything. And Neville Chamberlain, thinking he's going to preserve peace, goes along with that deal, hands over the Sudetenland to Hitler, and he believes that war is avoided. So you're going to analyze some cartoons. As you see in this cartoon, you see the appeaser, which is supposed to be symbolic of Neville Chamberlain. And yes, this is Dr. Seuss. And you see Neville Chamberlain or the appeaser handing out lollipops to these monsters, of course, these German Nazi monsters. And it says, remember, one more lollipop, and then you go home. And that's kind of the theme of appeasement in the lead up to World War II, is that all these aggressors, Japan, Italy, and especially Germany, were breaking international law and breaking international treaties, fair or unfair. And the Allies and the League of Nations were refusing to enforce it. And that only encouraged them to be more expansionistic and move on to a territory that they weren't willing to give up. The fear of this comes to a head in August 23rd, 1939, when everyone all of a sudden got really confused when Hitler and Joseph Stalin made a non-aggression pact, which was just an agreement never to fight each other. They would never attack one each other, which is strange because, of course, the Soviet Union, Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Union, they are communist, and Hitler is anti-communist, intensely anti-communist. So it kind of confused people. And in August, we're a short period away from September 1st of 1939, which is the invasion of Poland, the beginning of the war in Europe. For that week or so, people were in confusion in the international world, and there was fear that crisis was looming. And we'll look at the beginning of the war tomorrow. So you're going to look at your cartoon sources as well, and sources on appeasement.